All right. So in our previous lecture, we were talking about Homo ergaster and its biology. So today I want to talk a little bit about its culture and some of the cool things, because as much as Homo ergaster was a big evolutionary leap forward physically, it's also going to be a huge evolutionary leap forward in a lot of cool cultural things. And one of these things that it's going to form and be and advance a lot through is Homo ergaster is going to be the first hominin that's actually a hunter. We talked before about how Homo habilis and the Australopithecines were scavengers, and Homo ergaster is definitely still going to scavenge. They're not going to not scavenge because they think they're too good enough for it. But as I mentioned in the last lecture, Homo ergaster is now like 6 feet tall plus. It is they're like a normal body size in terms of us. And so they're finally big enough to be hunters. And we do have evidence that they're hunting big game animals, deer, but also things like African elephants and rhinos and things like that. And that they are going to, and we have the evidence of hunting weapons and marks on animal bones and things like that that show us that they were definitely hunting by 1.5 million years ago. And they were doing this through ambush hunting. So you would corner an animal and then just pretty much stab it with sticks until it dies. Because they don't have bows and arrows, they don't have very sophisticated hunting technology, but they do have some hunting technology. And the other thing is that, as we talked about in the last lecture, they do have brain expansion. And so they're also intelligent enough probably to have some form of rudimentary communication that's more than just like what a dog, cat, or chimpanzee can do. Do they have full-blown language yet? Jury's very much still out on that one. But they probably had enough ability to communicate, whether it was verbally, whether it was through sign language, or like some other signaling, that they probably could have like worked together to organize hunts to take down something like an elephant or a rhino. So they're also intelligent enough to be able to do that collectively together. That uses like actual strategy and actual forethought and planning that earlier hominins just weren't smart enough to be able to pull off or accomplish. Now, one of the other reasons that they're able to do successful hunting is because they also have better tools. So we talked before about how Homo habilis has that stone tool tradition called the Oldowan stone tool tradition. And it was good enough for what they needed to do, but it was also a really shitty stone tool tradition. In other words, it was just them bashing rocks together. They were unifacial, meaning they were only sharpening one side, so they weren't particularly sharp. They were just good enough to like cut off meat when you needed it, when you found an animal to scavenge, when you needed to break open bone to get some marrow. That's really all they were good for. Not much else. And so when we first find Homo ergaster, that's what they're doing. They're making these very early Oldowan tools. But eventually, sometime between 1.4 and 1.7 million years old, they're going to invent a new kind of stone tool technology called the Acheulean stone tool tradition. And this is going to be a very successful stone tool tradition. It's going to last as late as 115,000 years ago. Nobody really does anything different. Really, nobody does anything new or different with the Acheulean until really like the ancestors to us and the Neanderthals start popping up. So it's going to be a very long time before we get anything that's going to replace the Acheulean. Now, the Acheulean is going to differ from the Oldowan in a lot of ways, and all of these ways are why it's a better way of making stone tools than the Oldowan. First is that Homo ergaster is going to become a lot better and a lot smarter about picking better stone resources. In other words, better raw material. So when you're making stone tools, you are looking for the types of stones that exhibit what we call conchoidal fracture. That's a really fancy way of saying we want it to break like glass, and the way that glass breaks. And this is just because that it's predictable. It'll get you that really sharp cutting edge that you want. You can make a lot of different tools in a lot of different shapes and sizes when a rock breaks conchoidally. That's really what we're looking for. The best thing you could ever make a stone tool out of is obsidian, which is black volcanic glass. But chert and flint are also very good at this. Now, Homo habilis was really kind of just bashing rocks together. They weren't really smart about like knowing like which kind of rock was going to be better than any other. Homo ergaster, we have evidence that they are selecting very good materials of rock. And one of the reasons we know this is just because they could not be making the sophisticated stone tools they were making with shittier or worse raw materials. And so they're picking these better materials. And because they're doing that, they're able to make what are called bifacial stone tools. And this is where instead of just like knocking flakes off one side of a rock, you're knocking them off two sides. And what this is going to do is if you're knocking things off both sides, you're going to get a really thin edge. Think about a knife that you would cut with, right? Like the knife, if you're pointing the knife at yourself, it's going to kind of bow in on both sides because you're going to get a really nice sharp edge because it's kind of coming in on both sides. It's worked on both sides. If it was like a hunker and a flat on one side and only worked on the other side, right? Like you only have one side that you can cut on. That's not going to be a very good knife. The Oldowan tools were only on the one side. It's not a very good knife. The Acheulean tools are on both sides. It's going to get really thin, but this takes a lot more skill to manufacture. So you can see on some of these pictures in the like upper right-hand corner, you can see how they're getting very, very thin on the edges, and that's because they're being worked on both sides. So you can see the guy in the photo, you knock one flake off, you flip it over, you knock another flake off. You flip it over, you knock another flake off. And this is going to get you sharper, better stone tools. Now, the other reason that they can do this is because they're not doing what we called hard hammer percussion. So if you recall, when we talked about the Oldowan, hard hammer percussion is where you had your core, the thing in his hand that he wants to turn into a stone tool, and they were just taking another rock and bashing it. And it was called hard hammer percussion because the hammer stone, the thing you were using to smash was a rock. It was hard. It was just as hard as the material that you're trying to smash it with. With soft hammer percussion, we're kind of changing the game a little bit. We're changing the story. And rather than using a hard hammer, you're going to use a soft hammer. So rather than using something as hard as the core that you're trying to turn into a stone tool, you're going to use something that's softer. This is going to include things like antler, hardened wood, bone. Antler is really your best, but if you can't get it, bone and wood are going to be good for you. And when you do this, rather than just knocking two rocks together, you're actually going to hit it with your soft hammer. As you can see in the photo, it looks like he's using antler there. You're going to hit it, and that antler is actually going to absorb a lot of the shock because it's a softer material. And this allows you to have a lot more control about what kind of force is going into the core to create that stone tool instead of just like praying that something comes out. So because of that, you're not really like bashing rocks together. You're like peeling flakes off the core that are going to get you things that look like the stone tools that you see in the photo right now. The other major really cool thing that's going on here with their stone tool technology is that the Acheulean is going to be the first tradition that exhibits what we call stone tool standardization. So the Oldowan tools, the Homo habilis tools, they look like crap. Right? Like they all look different. They were just bashing rocks together, trying to get the best, cutting edge they could. Once they got something that will break open that bone so they could eat the marrow, they were good enough. They were good to go. They were like, we rocking this. Homo ergaster here is going to say, no, we don't just like make tools willy-nilly. We just don't make them at random. We actually have very clear, defined ways of making stone tools. And so what you see in the photo here is what we call an Acheulean hand axe. This is the most common form of Acheulean stone tool. And they all look like this. They are very heavily standardized. They are all made in exactly or nearly exactly the same way. All across Africa, in Asia, even in Europe where we find them, everybody's going to be making this hand axe this exact way. So what this shows us is that Homo ergaster was intelligent enough to not only invent a better way of making stone tools, but that they could have forethought and planning, because to make something like what you see on the screen right now, that requires you to follow step 1, followed by step 2, followed by step 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever. You have to be smart enough in order to follow that. And if you're not going to follow that, then you're not going to get a hand axe. So you have to be smart enough to follow a series of steps. And this requires higher cognitive levels of thinking. And so this also gives us some indication of how intelligent they are, and that they were probably pretty intelligent. In addition to stone tools, there's some evidence that Homo ergaster was also making fire. And fire, the reason we think that they had fire was because fire is going to open up some new doors for you as a species. It allows you to live in colder climates, and eventually we're going to move into Europe. So we know they had fire to survive in Europe. It allows you to make better weapons like fire-hardened wood spears. It allows you to cook your food. And we've talked about this before, but cooking your food is important because that allows for brain expansion. Our guts are very small because we don't dedicate a lot of our energy to our digestive system. We put all that energy up into our brains. Our brains are the most calorically needy things in our entire bodies. That's why, like, if you are running around and you skip a meal by accident or something, you start to get a headache. And it's because the first thing that's going to shut down in your body is your brain, because it needs a lot of calories. If it's going to suck up all those calories, other things have got to give. And what we've done is we've given up on our digestive system. And I think I've mentioned this before, but that's why your dog can go outside and eat whatever shit it wants and be fine. And you eat one small little wrong berry and like all of a sudden you're throwing up or you have like a tummy ache. So what we've done is we've given up a lot of our digestive tract energy to go to our brain. And the reason we could do that is because we cook our food. We are less likely to consume things like parasites and bacteria because our food is cooked. Cooked food is easier to digest than raw food. Again, that's why if you cook your broccoli, it's a lot easier to just digest it. And if you eat a lot of raw broccoli, you might get a stomach ache. It's just easier to digest those types of things. So there's a lot of evidence that Homo ergaster, when we think about it logically, had fire because they are eventually going to move up into Europe. Way after everywhere else, and we'll get to that in just a second. We do have evidence eventually that they're making these fire-hardened spears, and the fact that their brains are expanding might give us evidence that their gut is shrinking, and that maybe that means they're cooking their food. However, we don't have a lot of clear archaeological evidence of this beyond just thinking about it logically. We have evidence that suggests that people were controlling fire and had hearths and fireplaces and things like that around 1 million years ago. There might be evidence from China that dates back to 1.5 million years ago. And we definitely have evidence of fire from 700,000 years ago. Now, the reason that this is such a big question is because it's hard to determine whether a fire is a natural fire or a human-made fire, right? Because how archaeologically you're digging in the ground, you find a bunch of charcoal, that's evidence that a fire was there. But was that because somebody made that fire, or did a lightning strike there and there was just a small forest fire or something? Or was it really hot and sunny one day on the savannah and really dry, and all of a sudden some grass just randomly caught on fire? It's really hard to tell. So what we know is that there's no definitive proof that Homo ergaster made fire. But this doesn't mean that they couldn't have just been using natural sources of fire. It doesn't mean that they couldn't have found a lightning strike something and then they go up and they got a big stick and made a torch and then brought it back to their home and wherever they're at, and then built a fire from it and then cooked food and did what they needed to do. Using fire is not always the same as making fire. You can use natural sources of fire if you need to. But there's still a big question mark around fire for Homo ergaster, although logically it makes sense that they did. We just don't have a lot of evidence that they did, so we can't say one way or the other. Now, the last major really cool thing that Homo ergaster did was Homo ergaster is not only the first member of Homo, but is the first hominin species at all that leaves Africa. They originated in Africa, and that's because the earliest examples and earliest evidence we have of Homo ergaster is in Africa. That's how we know they evolved there. But we know that around 1.8 million years that they are going to leave. And so it's really cool because that means like Homo ergaster pops up around 1.8, 1.9, maybe 2 million years ago. And then pretty quickly later, they just kind of peace out. I do want to make it clear, though, when I'm saying all this, that when I say Homo ergaster left Africa, not all of them left Africa. Most Homo ergaster stayed behind. It's not like they had a, the annual meeting of the Homo ergaster species and they all decided to leave Africa. There's still a lot of them. They're in North Africa, they're in East Africa, they're in South Africa. Just a population of ones in East Africa decide to leave and go into Asia. So don't think that there's no Homo ergaster left. There's definitely plenty of Homo ergaster individuals still running around Africa even after this group leaves. Now, that leaves us with two major questions: how and why. How is pretty easy to answer. They likely went up through the Nile Valley and exited Africa across the Arabian land bridge. This is still the Ice Age. It's the Pleistocene. Sea levels are low, so there's a lot more land connecting Southwest Asia to Africa. It's not super hard to get from one of these places to the other. So that's likely how they did it. And that's not much of a question for us. The bigger question, though, is why? Why did our lineage evolve before 6 million years ago? And then for at least 4.5 million years, just kind of putzed around Africa and didn't leave. And then all of a sudden, Homo ergaster, or a group of Homo ergasters, was like, why don't we leave? So the big question is why? So a lot of different answers have been proposed, but probably the best theory is that there was probably a point in time where Africa became particularly dry. Again, this is the Ice Age. We've been talking about how it's getting cooler and drier. And this means that there wasn't a lot of plant goods available, which means that there would have been a lot of pressure and a lot of competition for resources. Homo ergaster would have been competing against Homo habilis that's still running around. Some Paranthropus is still running around. Obviously, all of the other major animals on the savannah are also running around. So with local resources being depleted, Homo ergaster might have been kind of like, well, if we leave and we go that way, away from everybody, there might be more resources. And remember, they're more intelligent than all of these other animals. They're also better bipeds because they have those longer legs, those more modern hips, that more modern body plan that makes them more efficient bipeds. So they can walk and run for longer distances. So they might have been just like, you know what, like we got to get out of Dodge because there's just not enough food here for everybody. And keep in mind that like northeastern Africa, so thinking about like modern day Egypt, and Southwest Asia, so the modern day Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, would have had very similar environments at this time. They both would have been like savanna grasslands. So it wasn't like Homo ergaster was walking into the unknown. They would have been going to a place where they understood the local flora, fauna, and how to survive there, just with less other hominids and less other animals competing for those same resources. So that's potential. They also might have just wound up there accidentally by following herd movements. So they might have just been like following a herd of elephants or rhinos or whatever, because, you know, then they could hunt them and pick them off as they needed them, and then looked around and was like, wait, where am I? Right? Have you ever been like listening to music or a podcast while walking around? Or even driving, even that's a little more dangerous in this case, where you're just like looking around, you're like, I don't know how I got here. And sometimes you're like, I don't even really know where I am, because you were just like so in it. That could have been a thing, but for hunting. There's also some geologic evidence that East Africa was experiencing a lot of volcanic activity at this time. And so that might have also been environmentally disruptive and might have pushed Homo ergaster away. And so after they leave Africa, there's going to be a lot of sites you can see in East Africa, North Africa. They're also in South Africa. Not all of the sites are labeled on this map. They're going to make it into China. They're going to make it as far down into Indonesia, into the island of Java. So where you see like Sangren and Trinil and all that labeled. That's the island of Java. And all of that would have been connected to Southeast Asia through land because sea levels were lower. So all of that is also going on all at the same time. So I'm going to cut the lecture here. But when we come back, we're going to talk about, okay, now that they've left Africa, does that mean that the Asian versions are a different species or are they the same species?